Clara's world shatters the moment she discovers her fiancé in bed with her vicious stepsister, Chloe, who merely smirks and mercilessly mocks her as a pathetic, freeloading leftover. Fleeing the humiliating confrontation, Clara blindly stumbles into the wrong VIP hotel suite, freezing in her tracks as she spots a towering, dangerously scarred stranger mid-shower. She can only hold her breath as this mysterious, dark-eyed titan casually authorizes a ruthless underground syndicate takeover and coldly dismisses his family's forced marriage plans. After a frantic, breathless escape, Clara's nightmare deepens when her phone rings. The hospital is demanding an immediate $150,000 to secure her mother's life-saving transplant. Driven to absolute desperation, she rushes home to confront her abusive stepmother, Evelyn, demanding her rightful inheritance. The argument violently escalates, resulting in the shattering of Evelyn's $500,000 antique vase, a disaster the older woman maliciously forces Clara to pay for. Trapped with an impossible debt due by dawn and her mother's life hanging by a thread, Evelyn and Chloe issue a cruel, inescapable ultimatum. Clara must take Chloe's place and marry Vincent Morreti, a rumored penniless, violent ex-convict and the disgraced outcast of Chicago's most feared mafia family. In exchange, the debt is completely erased and her mother's surgery will be fully funded. The harsh silence in the expansive living room was broken only by the sharp click of a sleek pen being placed on the glass coffee table. Evelyn slid a crisp legal document forward with manicured fingers. It was a complete waiver of inheritance. Every asset, every property, and every single penny left behind by her late father would be surrendered to her stepmother. Clara stared at the terrifying black ink. Her vision blurred as hot tears welled up, threatening to spill over her pale cheeks. She fiercely blinked them away, lifting a trembling hand to wipe her face. She absolutely refused to show any more weakness in front of these monsters. Chloe stood near the marble fireplace, leisurely examining her polished fingernails, her lips curled into a victorious smirk. She had stolen the man Clara loved, paraded the betrayal openly, and was now happily watching Clara sell her soul to a rumored beast. "Sign it," Evelyn commanded, her voice dripping with venomous impatience. "The hospital administrator is waiting for the transfer confirmation. One delay, and they pull the plug on your dear mother. Make your choice right now." The pen felt incredibly heavy, as if it were forged from solid lead. Clara swallowed the thick lump in her throat. The image of her mother, frail and attached to countless tubes in the sterile hospital ward, flashed vividly in her mind. True love and filial duty overpowered her profound sense of injustice. With a broken heart, Clara grabbed the pen and pressed the tip to the paper. Her signature was shaky but definitive. She had just signed away her entire life and legacy. Evelyn immediately snatched the document, a look of pure, unadulterated greed illuminating her face. She picked up her phone and made a brief call, confirming the payment to the hospital billing department. "The money is sent," Evelyn said coldly, her eyes flashing with triumph. "Now go pack your pathetic belongings. Your new husband is sending a ride for you tonight. I want you out of my sight before midnight." Clara turned around without saying a single word. Her legs felt like jelly as she climbed the grand, sweeping staircase to the room that used to be her safe haven. The walls seemed to close in on her. The psychological torment was suffocating. She pulled a worn suitcase from the back of her closet, entirely ignoring the expensive designer dresses and sparkling jewelry her father had gifted her in the past. She only packed absolute necessities, some basic clothing, a few faded photographs of her parents smiling together, and a simple silver necklace her mother had given her on her 18th birthday. When the suitcase was zipped shut, the horrifying reality of her situation finally crushed her. Clara collapsed onto the cold hardwood floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. A silent sob wrecked her fragile body. She was being discarded like worthless trash, traded to a violent criminal just to settle a debt she did not even owe. Vincent Morreti. The name echoed in her mind like a definitive death sentence. The entire city of Chicago knew the dark rumors surrounding the disgraced mafia heir. They said he was a madman, a bloodthirsty convict who had been violently thrown out of his own powerful syndicate for being too uncontrollable and savage. People whispered that he lived in pure squalor, surviving on violence and unchecked rage. She was willingly walking straight into the jaws of a monster. Hours passed in a blur of agonizing anxiety and quiet weeping. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed late into the freezing night. Clara carried her lonely suitcase down the long driveway, the biting wind cutting cruelly through her thin coat. She stood alone by the towering iron gates of the estate, casting one last look at the mansion that was no longer her home. She felt entirely abandoned by the world. Through the dense midnight fog, a pair of dim headlights slowly approached. Clara braced herself, expecting a blacked-out luxury vehicle typical of the criminal underworld. Instead, a rusted, heavily dented pickup truck roared down the street, its engine sputtering wildly before screeching to a halt right in front of her. The exhaust pipe belched a thick cloud of dark smoke into the freezing air. The passenger door groaned open with a harsh metallic scrape. The interior of the cabin was cloaked in heavy shadows. Clara could only make out the massive, imposing silhouette of the driver. He sat perfectly still, his broad shoulders practically filling the entire front seat. As the faint amber glow of a distant street lamp filtered through the cracked windshield, it illuminated a rugged jawline and the dangerous glint of dark, emotionless eyes. It was the exact same overwhelming aura she had briefly sensed in that hotel room earlier, though her current terror clouded her memory, preventing her from making the connection. "Get in," a low, gravelly voice commanded. The tone was absolute, leaving no room for hesitation or argument. Clara tightened her grip on her suitcase handle until her knuckles turned completely white. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she stepped forward into the murky darkness of the vehicle, leaving her past behind and entering a terrifying new world. The rusted truck rumbled through the desolate, rain-slicked streets of Chicago. Clara sat frozen against the passenger door, pressing her fragile body into the cold vinyl seat. She did not dare to speak or look directly at the massive man sitting behind the steering wheel. The silence in the cramped cabin was suffocating, thick with an unspoken tension that made it incredibly hard for her to breathe. The air smelled strongly of motor oil, cheap tobacco, and stale leather. Every time the vehicle hit a pothole, Clara flinched, terrified that any sudden movement might provoke the beast beside her. Eventually, the sputtering vehicle jerked to a halt in front of a bleak, decaying municipal building just as the first gray light of dawn broke over the slumbering city. This was certainly not a grand cathedral or a picturesque venue. It was a miserable registry office situated in the absolute worst, most dangerous part of town. Vincent Morreti stepped out into the freezing morning air and walked around the hood to forcefully yank her door open. In the harsh, unforgiving daylight, Clara finally got a clear, unobstructed look at her future husband. He looked nothing like a wealthy, privileged mafia heir. He wore faded blue denim pants stained with grease, heavy steel-toed work boots, and a worn-out leather jacket thrown carelessly over a cheap, thin cotton shirt. However, the threadbare clothing could not hide the thick, dangerous slabs of pure muscle underneath. His broad chest and thick arms seemed to test the limits of the fabric. His strong jaw was covered in dark, rough stubble, and a faint, jagged scar traced down the side of his neck, disappearing mysteriously into his collar. His dark, deep-set eyes were completely unreadable, looking like bottomless pits of cold indifference. He radiated an overwhelming aura of pure, suppressed violence that made Clara want to shrink away into the nearest shadows. They walked together into the sterile, flickering fluorescent-lit waiting room. The walls were painted a sickly shade of green, peeling at the corners. A thoroughly bored clerk sitting behind a scratched glass counter handed them a thick stack of standard marriage certificates without even bothering to look up. There were no beautiful flowers, no romantic music, and absolutely no smiling family members to celebrate the union. The entire wedding ceremony lasted exactly 5 minutes. Vincent uttered his required vows in a flat, gravelly monotone, his voice devoid of any human emotion. Clara forced the heavy words past her fiercely trembling lips, her sweet voice barely a whisper echoing in the empty room. When the clerk lazily told them they could seal the legal union, Vincent did not reach out to hold her. He did not lean in to kiss his new bride. He simply picked up the freshly signed papers, turned his broad back toward her, and walked straight toward the exit. Clara gathered her thin coat tightly around her shivering frame and hurried to follow his long strides. They had to walk several blocks down a gritty, trash-littered alleyway to reach the spot where he had parked the truck. The neighborhood was a decaying industrial zone, reeking heavily of rotting garbage, motor oil, and stale beer. Clara kept her head down, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs with every single step she took. She felt like prey walking blindly through a dark forest. Suddenly, a noisy group of local thugs spilled out from a narrow side street, completely blocking their path. Most of the men instinctively stepped aside when they saw the towering figure of Vincent approaching, sensing the deadly danger radiating from him. But one young, heavily tattooed street punk, clearly high on some illegal synthetic substance, boldly stepped forward and locked his bloodshot eyes on Clara. The punk stumbled clumsily, a deeply lecherous grin splitting his dirty face. He completely ignored the giant man walking just steps ahead and reached a filthy, unwashed hand toward Clara. He was aiming to grab her delicate shoulder, murmuring something absolutely vile under his breath. Clara gasped loudly and squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body tensing as she braced for the unwanted, sickening contact. But the terrible touch never came. In a blinding blur of motion that was impossibly fast for a man of his massive size, Vincent pivoted on his heel. His large, calloused hand shot out like a striking viper. His thick fingers wrapped securely and viciously around the throat of the approaching thug. Without showing any signs of physical strain, Vincent lifted the squirming man several inches off the cracked concrete pavement using just one single arm. The punk instantly gasped for air, his hands flying up to claw helplessly at the iron grip that was effortlessly crushing his windpipe. The thug kicked his legs wildly, his eyes bulging in sudden, raw panic as he realized the fatal mistake he had just made. Vincent did not shout a single word. He did not even blink his dark eyes. He simply tilted his head slightly, staring directly into the face of the choking man with a look of absolute, chilling emptiness. It was the merciless gaze of an apex predator observing an incredibly insignificant insect before crushing it. The ambient air around them seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees, turning to pure ice. Clara watched in paralyzed horror as the violent thug began to thrash weakly, his face rapidly turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. The terrifying display of raw physical power and pure murderous intent was utterly overwhelming. A sudden, pathetic puddle began to form rapidly on the concrete beneath the dangling man. The thug had completely lost control of his bladder, wetting himself in sheer, unadulterated terror. Only when the man was on the very brink of passing out did Vincent finally loosen his brutal grip. He tossed the weeping, humiliated punk into a nearby pile of overflowing garbage bags like a broken, discarded toy. The rest of the street gang scattered instantly, running for their absolute lives into the dark shadows of the alley. Vincent calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean white handkerchief, wiped his large hand meticulously, and dropped the cloth directly onto the gasping, terrified man in the trash. He turned back to Clara, his rugged expression completely blank once again, acting as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. They continued their agonizingly silent walk until they reached a towering metal gate surrounding a dilapidated auto repair shop. Thick black grease stained the brick walls, and the muddy yard was filled with the rusting, skeletal remains of broken-down cars. This grim, desolate place was his domain. This was her new home. Clara swallowed hard, tasting the bitter fear in the back of her throat, realizing with absolute certainty that she had just bound her entire life to a very real, incredibly dangerous beast. Clara followed Vincent up a steep flight of rusted metal stairs attached to the exterior of the bleak auto shop. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and pure dread. He unlocked a heavy steel door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter. She walked into the dimly lit space expecting a squalid, filthy den matching the terrifying reputation of the disgraced mafia outcast. Instead, she found a small, meticulously clean apartment. The worn wooden floors were swept spotless, and the faint scent of bleach and fresh linen completely masked the heavy odor of oil from the garage below. There was a tiny kitchenette, a modest living space occupied by a faded fabric sofa, and a single door leading to the only bedroom. Clara stood frozen in the center of the room, her small hands clutching her battered suitcase like a physical shield. The terrible moment of truth had finally arrived. She was now legally bound to this massive, scarred stranger, a man who possessed the capacity for explosive, lethal violence. She tightly squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for his heavy hands to grab her, expecting him to drag her into the bedroom and claim what he had effectively purchased from her wicked stepmother. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy thud of his work boots echoed on the floorboards as he moved closer. Clara stopped breathing, but he simply walked past her. She opened her eyes to see Vincent pull a spare gray blanket and a flat pillow from a small hallway closet. He turned to face her, his expression entirely unreadable. He raised a large, calloused hand and pointed toward the closed bedroom door. Then, without uttering a single syllable, he walked over to the cramped, faded sofa in the living room, dropped the blanket onto the cushions, and sat down to unlace his heavy boots. He was giving her the only bed. Clara stared at him in utter disbelief. When she realized he was not going to follow her or demand anything more, she hurried into the bedroom and quickly locked the door behind her. She collapsed onto the clean mattress, burying her face in the soft pillows. The overwhelming relief broke her composure, and she cried silently into the dark until absolute exhaustion finally pulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Clara awoke to a stream of bright golden sunlight filtering through the narrow window blinds. For a brief second, she forgot where she was. Then the stark reality of her new life rushed back, making her stomach twist into tight knots. But another sensation quickly distracted her panic. The rich, mouth-watering aroma of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and buttery toasted bread wafted under the bedroom door. Her stomach rumbled loudly. She had not eaten a proper meal in almost 2 days. Slowly and cautiously, Clara unlocked the bedroom door and peeked out into the main living area. She fully expected to find the terrifying brute from the previous day nursing a bottle of cheap liquor or cleaning a weapon. The sight that actually greeted her made her stop dead in her tracks, completely paralyzing her mind. Vincent was standing in the tiny kitchenette. The towering, muscular giant who had effortlessly choked a grown man to the brink of death in a dirty alleyway was currently wearing a simple canvas baking apron over a clean white shirt. His massive back was turned to her as he expertly flipped eggs in a hot frying pan with a delicate flick of his wrist. On the counter beside him, 2 plates were already arranged with perfectly cooked bacon and golden hash browns. If that was not shocking enough, Clara noticed her pastel blue work blouse resting on a small, sturdy table next to the kitchen counter. Vincent turned off the stove, wiped his large hands on a clean towel, and picked up a steaming iron. With surprising gentleness and meticulous precision, the deadly mafia outcast began pressing the wrinkles out of her delicate clothing. He smoothed the fabric flat, ensuring every single crease was eliminated, treating the cheap cotton shirt as if it were a priceless piece of fragile silk. Clara let out a tiny, involuntary gasp. Vincent immediately stopped moving. He set the hot iron down and turned around to face her. In the bright morning light, his rugged features looked less intimidating. The dark stubble on his jaw was still there, but the cold emptiness in his deep eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady focus. He carefully placed her perfectly pressed blouse on a wooden hanger and hooked it over the back of a chair. He gestured toward the small dining table where the 2 plates of food sat steaming. "Eat," he said. His deep, gravelly voice was low, but it lacked the terrifying edge from the night before. Clara obeyed automatically, her legs moving like mechanical parts. She sat down on the wooden chair, staring at the beautiful breakfast spread before her. Vincent poured a hot cup of coffee and placed it gently near her trembling hand. He then sat down opposite her, his massive frame making the small table look like a miniature toy. Clara picked up her fork, her fingers shaking slightly. She took a small bite of the eggs. They were absolutely flawless, melting in her mouth with a burst of rich flavor. She looked up at him, her beautiful eyes wide with profound confusion. How could the same hands that dealt such ruthless violence also create such warmth and care? Why was he treating her like an honored guest instead of a bought prisoner? Vincent met her confused gaze squarely. He leaned forward slightly, resting his thick forearms on the table. The intense, unyielding sincerity in his dark eyes pinned her in place. "I know why you are here, Clara," Vincent stated quietly, speaking her name for the very first time. It sounded strange, but incredibly grounding coming from his lips. "I know about your mother. I know what Evelyn forced you to do. You think I am a monster, and outside these walls, maybe you are right. But listen to me carefully." He paused, making sure she was absorbing every single word. "In this place, no one is ever allowed to hurt you. Not me. Not anyone else. You are safe here." The absolute certainty in his voice resonated deep within her chest. It was not a plea for trust, nor was it an empty promise. It was an ironclad decree spoken by a man accustomed to making the world bend to his absolute will. Clara felt a sudden, sharp prick of tears in her eyes. The heavy, impenetrable walls of fear she had built around her shattered heart began to show their very first cracks. As she sat across from the deadly beast wearing a domestic apron, Clara felt an unexpected, fragile spark of genuine warmth blooming slowly in the darkest corners of her soul. Clara stepped off the crowded city bus, carefully adjusting the collar of her pastel blue blouse. The fabric was flawlessly pressed, carrying the faint, comforting scent of fresh linen from the small apartment above the rusted garage. It felt like a gentle armor protecting her against the harsh reality of the outside world. She walked into the sleek, modern lobby of the advertising agency where she worked as a junior graphic designer. Even though her mother was safely prepared for surgery and the massive debt was temporarily erased, Clara absolutely refused to be financially dependent. She needed her own money to rebuild her shattered life. She sat at her small cubicle, burying her focus in the bright computer screen. For a few hours, the rhythmic clicking of her mouse offered a brief escape from the terrifying reality of her forced marriage. But the temporary peace was violently shattered when a heavy hand clamped down on her delicate shoulder. Clara flinched, her entire body tensing as the suffocating smell of expensive, overpowering cologne assaulted her senses. It was Marcus, the senior creative director. He was a notorious predator in the office, a man who constantly abused his corporate authority to torment female employees. Marcus leaned in uncomfortably close, his hot breath brushing against her neck. He whispered vile, inappropriate comments about her appearance, his thick fingers trailing down her arm. Clara politely but firmly asked him to step back, her voice trembling slightly. Instead of leaving, Marcus cornered her against the edge of the desk. He sneered, threatening to ruin her career and make sure she never found work in Chicago again if she rejected his advances. Panic surged through her veins. She felt incredibly small, completely trapped in a nightmare with no escape in sight. Miles away, deep beneath the glittering skyscrapers of the city, the atmosphere was a terrifying contrast to the bright corporate office. A sleek, blocked-out luxury vehicle pulled into a highly secured underground parking cavern. The heavy door swung open, and Vincent Morreti stepped out into the shadows. He was no longer wearing the faded denim and cheap cotton shirt. He was dressed in a pristine, custom-tailored dark suit that perfectly accentuated his massive, imposing frame. He walked slowly through a set of heavy steel double doors and entered an exclusive, dimly lit underground club. This was the absolute nerve center of the Chicago underworld. Dozens of heavily armed men wearing sharp suits immediately stopped what they were doing. They stood up straight and bowed their heads in profound, fearful respect. Vincent did not acknowledge them. He exuded an aura of absolute power and cold-blooded authority. He was not a disgraced outcast. He was the true dawn of the Morreti family, secretly controlling his vast empire from the shadows while his enemies blindly believed he was a broken man. Vincent sat down on a plush leather armchair at the head of a long mahogany table, accepting a glass of expensive amber liquor from a terrified subordinate. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his phone. Before Clara had left the apartment that morning, he had secretly slipped a microscopic audio transmitter into the side pocket of her handbag. It was a necessary precaution to ensure his absolute promise that no one would ever hurt her. He pressed a small earpiece into his ear, expecting to hear the mundane sounds of typing and office chatter. Instead, he heard the sickening, arrogant voice of Marcus threatening his wife. He heard Clara gasp, her voice tight with genuine fear as the manager grabbed her wrist. The heavy crystal glass in the hand of the Don shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. The loud crack echoed through the silent room. The amber liquor spilled over his thick knuckles, mixing with a few drops of deep red blood from the broken glass. Every single hardened criminal in the underground club froze in pure, unadulterated terror, feeling the sudden, suffocating drop in temperature. The monstrous beast hiding beneath the refined suit had just been violently awakened. Vincent did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He pulled the earpiece out and looked at his chief financial enforcer standing nearby. The look in his dark eyes was completely devoid of human mercy. "Find out who owns the advertising agency where my wife works," Vincent ordered, his grovelly voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Buy the entire company immediately. I do not care how many millions it takes. You have exactly 10 minutes to complete the acquisition." And the senior director named Marcus, who is currently touching her, strip him of everything he owns and throw him out onto the street like the garbage he is. Back in the bright office building, Clara was desperately trying to pull her arm away from the aggressive grip of the manager. Marcus was laughing cruelly, fully enjoying his disgusting power trip. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the department burst wide open. A team of imposing corporate security guards stormed into the room, followed closely by the pale, sweating chief executive officer of the agency. Marcus dropped his hand, looking completely bewildered. Before he could speak a single word of protest, the executives descended upon him. In front of the entire stunned office, Marcus was loudly informed that the company had just undergone an immediate hostile takeover. The new unseen owner had specifically demanded his instant termination. The security guards grabbed the screaming, humiliated manager by his arms and forcefully dragged him out of the building without allowing him to pack a single pencil. The entire floor descended into shocked, echoing silence. Clara stood frozen by her desk, her large eyes wide with profound disbelief. She hugged her arms across her chest, staring at the empty space where her tormentor had stood just seconds ago. It felt like a miraculous, impossible coincidence. As she slowly sat back down in her chair, still trembling from the adrenaline, she had absolutely no idea that the invisible, terrifying shield protecting her from the shadows belonged to the quiet man who had cooked her eggs that morning. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine glass facade of the advertising agency. Clara stepped out of the revolving doors, taking a deep breath of the crisp city air. Her mind was still spinning from the bizarre events of the morning. The inexplicable, sudden termination of Marcus felt like a divine intervention, yet a lingering sense of unease settled in her stomach. However, her temporary relief evaporated instantly when she spotted two familiar, deeply unwelcome figures standing near the entrance of the plaza. Evelyn and Chloe were dressed head to toe in exorbitant designer couture, looking completely out of place among the tired office workers rushing home. They had clearly come with one single, cruel purpose: to revel in the absolute misery they had forced upon Clara. Chloe stepped forward with a malicious smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. She looked Clara up and down, her eyes filled with undisguised disgust. "Look at you," Chloe sneered loudly, ensuring passers-by could hear her toxic words. "You actually went to work after your pathetic wedding night. I guess when you are married to a penniless street thug, you have to scrub floors just to afford a decent meal. Tell me, does his filthy little garage smell like rotting garbage or just failure?" Evelyn let out a sharp, aristocratic laugh, adjusting her expensive diamond necklace. "We just wanted to check on our little sacrifice," she added mockingly. "Your father would be absolutely horrified to see his precious daughter living like a common beggar." But then again, you always were destined to end up in the gutter. Clara felt her face burn with deep humiliation. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but a loud, metallic screech suddenly pierced the air. The familiar rusted pickup truck lurched violently to a halt right at the curb, illegally parking in the drop-off zone. The engine sputtered a cloud of dark exhaust, drawing horrified stares from the elite corporate crowd. The heavy driver's side door creaked open, and Vincent stepped out onto the pristine pavement. He had completely shed his expensive dark suit from earlier in the day, seamlessly returning to his worn denim pants and stained cotton shirt. His massive, scarred frame looked incredibly intimidating against the backdrop of the sleek corporate building. Chloe burst into a fit of hysterical laughter. "Oh my God," she gasped, pointing a manicured finger at the imposing man. "Is that your husband? He looks like he crawls out of a sewer every morning." "Hey, garbage man," Chloe shouted, her voice shrill with arrogant confidence. "Do not park your piece of junk here. You are polluting the air for decent people." Vincent did not shout back. He did not even blink. He slowly closed the truck door and began walking toward them. His movements were terrifyingly deliberate, like a massive predator stalking a completely oblivious prey. The ambient noise of the busy street seemed to fade away as he closed the distance. Evelyn stopped laughing. The sheer physical density of the man approaching them sent a sudden, primal wave of panic through her veins. Vincent stopped mere inches away from the two women. His broad chest completely blocked out the sun, casting a dark, chilling shadow over their faces. He tilted his head slightly, his dark, dead eyes locking onto Chloe. When he finally spoke, his gravelly voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried an unbearable, suffocating weight. "If you ever speak to my wife again," Vincent murmured, his tone dripping with absolute, lethal certainty, "I will rip out your tongue and feed it to the stray dogs in the alley. If you ever look at her with that expression again, I will personally ensure you never open your eyes to see another sunrise. Now, take your miserable mother and run before I lose the tiny shred of patience I have left." The air around them turned into pure ice. Chloe physically recoiled, her face draining of all color until it was completely pale. The terrifying malice radiating from Vincent was not a cheap street threat. It was the absolute, undeniable promise of violent death. Evelyn began to shake violently, grabbing her daughter by the arm in sheer terror. Neither woman dared to utter a single syllable. They stumbled backward clumsily on their high heels, turning and practically sprinting toward their parked luxury vehicle as if the devil himself were chasing them. Vincent watched them flee with cold indifference before turning his attention back to Clara. The monstrous aura vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by the calm, steady presence she had seen over the breakfast table. He reached out and gently opened the passenger door of the rusted truck for her. Clara stepped inside, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. As the engine roared to life and they pulled away from the curb, she stared at the rugged profile of the man sitting beside her. Her mind raced with countless questions. No simple mechanic possessed that kind of bone-chilling authority. No mere street thug could make two of the most arrogant women in Chicago flee in absolute terror with just a few whispered words. As she looked at his calloused hands resting on the steering wheel, Clara began to truly wonder exactly who her broken, outcast husband really was. The rusted truck pulled into the darkened lot of the auto repair shop. Clara stepped out, her mind still replaying the terrifyingly calm way Vincent had banished her wicked stepmother and stepsister. They climbed the metal stairs in absolute silence. As soon as Clara unlocked the heavy door and stepped into the small apartment, her cellular phone began to ring loudly from her handbag. The caller identification displayed the name of the Central City Hospital. Her heart leaped into her throat. A cold wave of pure fear gripped her chest, making her assume the absolute worst had just happened to her fragile mother. With trembling fingers, Clara answered the call. The voice of the chief surgeon echoed through the small speaker. The doctor did not deliver bad news. Instead, he sounded completely astonished. He informed Clara that a team of top-tier international medical specialists had suddenly arrived by a private helicopter just a few hours ago, completely taking over her mother's critical case. The complex transplant surgery had been executed flawlessly. Furthermore, the doctor revealed that an anonymous benefactor had completely paid off every single medical expense, leaving a massive surplus of funds for premium postoperative care. Her mother was entirely safe, resting comfortably and guaranteed a full recovery. Clara dropped her phone onto the worn fabric sofa. The heavy, suffocating weight that had relentlessly crushed her chest for months instantly vanished into thin air. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed rapidly down her pale cheeks. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a breathless sob of profound relief. Vincent stood silently near the small kitchenette, his massive frame perfectly still as he watched her emotional breakdown. He knew exactly what the incredible phone call was about, having orchestrated the entire medical miracle from his secure underground club earlier that very day, but his rugged face remained beautifully unreadable. Overwhelmed by the sudden rush of intense emotion, Clara felt an absolute need to celebrate this miraculous turn of events. She wiped her wet eyes, walked over to the small kitchen cabinet, and pulled out a cheap bottle of red wine she had purchased on her way home a few days prior. She poured 2 generous glasses, her small hands shaking wildly with leftover adrenaline. She walked over to Vincent and cautiously offered him one of the fragile glasses. He looked down at the dark red liquid, then up into her bright, tear-filled eyes, and slowly accepted the drink. Clara drank her wine rapidly, the warm alcohol flooding her exhausted veins and significantly lowering her heavy emotional barriers. The tiny apartment grew incredibly quiet as the evening shadows stretched deeply across the wooden floorboards. The intoxicating alcohol gave Clara a sudden, reckless surge of liquid courage. She looked up at the towering man standing patiently before her. He was supposed to be a highly dangerous monster, a violent criminal who ruined innocent lives. Yet, since the very moment they first met at the miserable registry office, he had provided nothing but absolute safety, warm food, and an impenetrable shield against her cruel enemies. Driven by a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude and a blossoming affection she could no longer deny, Clara closed the physical distance between them. She threw her arms tightly around his thick waist, pressing her face against his broad, solid chest. Vincent froze completely. His massive muscles turned to solid granite beneath his thin cotton shirt. He was utterly unaccustomed to such gentle, willing affection from anyone. Clara held him tightly, her slender fingers splaying wide across his expansive back. As she pressed her soft hands against his shirt, her sensitive fingertips inadvertently mapped the rugged, uneven terrain of his skin underneath. She felt thick, raised ridges of jagged tissue and deep, circular indentations scattered violently across his shoulder blades. They were absolutely unmistakable. They were brutal bullet wounds and vicious knife scars. The terrifying physical evidence of a brutally violent past filled with immense pain. But instead of pulling away in absolute horror, Clara let out a soft sigh and traced the terrifying scars with a profound, tender reverence, silently accepting every single broken part of his dark history. That gentle, deeply accepting touch was the exact catalyst that finally shattered his ironclad restraint. The beastly control he had rigidly maintained since their forced wedding completely snapped in half. Vincent let out a low, rough growl deep in the back of his throat. He blindly dropped his wine glass onto the kitchen counter with a loud clatter, not caring at all about the dark red liquid spilling everywhere. His large, calloused hands reached down and cupped her delicate face, tilting her head upward with an urgent desperation. His dark eyes blazed with a raw, consuming fire that instantly took her breath away. Without a single word of warning, he crashed his lips against hers. The kiss was absolutely not gentle. It was fiercely demanding, desperate, and incredibly hungry, fueled by years of dark isolation and the sudden, blinding light she had unknowingly brought into his chaotic, violent world. Clara gasped against his warm mouth, her fingers tangling tightly into his thick dark hair. The sweet, sharp taste of the red wine mingled perfectly with the intoxicating, rich scent of his masculine cologne. Vincent pulled her flush against his massive body, lifting her slightly off the wooden floor, completely enveloping her fragile frame in his immense protective shadow. The intense physical friction ignited a wild, undeniable passion between them, burning away the cold, bitter remnants of their twisted marriage contract. In that breathless, heated moment, the terrifying mafia outcast and the desperate, beautiful graphic designer truly became one entity, bound together forever by an incredibly deep, unbreakable emotional gravity. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the narrow blinds of the small apartment, casting golden lines across the empty mattress. Clara woke up alone, but the lingering scent of rich masculine cologne and clean soap remained deep within the fabric of the pillow beside her. The vivid memory of their passionate, desperate kiss sent a sudden, electric thrill cascading down her spine. Her lips still felt slightly bruised, a beautiful reminder of the overwhelming hunger Vincent had shown her the night before. For the very first time since her father passed away, Clara felt a profound sense of genuine security. She dressed for work and stepped out into the bustling city streets, a rare, radiant smile completely illuminating her face. The crushing, suffocating weight of her mother balancing between life and death was entirely gone. Her husband, despite his rugged exterior and calloused hands, possessed a soul capable of immense gentleness. She was finally ready to embrace this bizarre, unexpected marriage and discover the true man hiding behind the quiet mechanic. During her brief afternoon lunch break, Clara walked to a quiet corner cafe located just 2 blocks away from the advertising agency. She purchased a warm cup of tea, enjoying the crisp city breeze. As she stepped out onto the paved sidewalk, a sleek silver luxury vehicle pulled up abruptly to the curb, its tires screeching softly against the concrete. 2 massive men wearing immaculate dark suits immediately stepped out of the front doors, moving with terrifying synchronization to block her path. Before the cold grip of panic could fully take root in her chest, a third man emerged gracefully from the spacious back seat. He was incredibly handsome, dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit. His dark hair was styled to absolute perfection, and his sharp, aristocratic facial features eerily mirrored the strong jawline of Vincent. However, his eyes were completely devoid of any human warmth. They were the calculating, merciless eyes of a venomous snake observing a trapped mouse. He offered a charming yet deeply chilling smile, adjusting his expensive silk tie as he stepped directly into her personal space. "Please do not be frightened, Clara," the man said, his voice as smooth as liquid velvet. "I simply want to have a brief family chat. My name is Vincent Morreti." Clara stiffened instantly, her fingers clutching her paper cup tight enough to dent the cardboard. She recognized the notorious last name. This was the wealthy, powerful side of the family that had allegedly cast Vincent out into the dirty streets. Dominic politely requested a moment of her time, gesturing gracefully toward a secluded, shaded bench in the nearby urban park. The 2 towering bodyguards stood perfectly still, their silent presence creating an invisible prison around her. Having absolutely no other choice and not wanting to cause a public scene, Clara forced her trembling legs to follow him. Dominic sat down on the wooden bench, crossing his long legs with an air of absolute superiority. He began to speak in a measured, calculated tone, praising her striking beauty and noting that his cousin Vincent always possessed a specific, dangerous appetite for fragile things. Clara immediately bristled at his condescending words. She boldly attempted to defend her husband, stating firmly that Vincent was a good, hard-working man who had been unjustly ruined by his own cruel relatives. Dominic burst into a fit of cold, mocking laughter that echoed unpleasantly in the quiet park. "A good, hard-working man?" Dominic repeated, wiping a fake tear of amusement from his eye. "Oh, you poor, beautifully naive creature. He has played his role absolutely flawlessly." Dominic reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive jacket and pulled out a thick brown envelope. He tossed it casually onto the empty space on the wooden bench between them. He leaned back and urged her to look inside the package. With heavily trembling fingers, Clara slowly opened the flap and pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs. The warm color completely drained from her face in a fraction of a second, leaving her pale and breathless. The very first image was a high-resolution security capture of the hotel corridor from the exact day she had discovered her fiancé cheating on her. The picture clearly showed Clara stumbling away in tears. But right behind her, standing inside the doorway of the opulent VIP suite, was Vincent. He was not wearing a cheap cotton shirt or faded denim. He was wearing a magnificent designer suit, surrounded by heavily armed men, casually commanding the room with absolute authority. He was the mysterious, powerful billionaire she had accidentally stumbled upon that fateful day. He was the terrifying Mr. X. Clara frantically flipped to the next picture, and a sharp gasp of pure horror escaped her lungs. It was a surveillance image taken from the high angle of a dark, abandoned warehouse. Vincent was standing directly under a single spotlight, surrounded by a massive pool of dark, thick blood. He was holding a heavy metallic weapon, his face twisted in a mask of absolute, monstrous fury. Several mutilated bodies lay completely motionless at his heavy steel-toed boots. He looked like an apocalyptic demon ascending straight from hell. Dominic leaned closer, leaning in to whisper his toxic words directly into her ear. Vincent was never an outcast, Clara. He is the current, active boss of the entire underworld. He is the most ruthless, bloodthirsty Don the city of Chicago has ever seen. The dirty mechanic routine is merely an elaborate, highly calculated theatrical act. Clara shook her head rapidly, hot tears blurring her vision as she stared at the bloody photographs. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking with profound betrayal. "Why would he pretend? Why would he marry me?" Dominic smiled, a cruel twisting of his lips that signaled his ultimate victory. He dropped his voice to a sympathetic pitch that felt completely artificial and vile. Why would a billionaire crime lord marry a desperate, indebted girl from a ruined family? Because he needs a perfect camouflage, Clara. Vincent is currently plotting a massive, violent underground war to secure absolute dominance. Taking a pathetic, highly vulnerable wife makes him look weak, distracted, and soft to his many enemies. You are nothing but a convenient, disposable pawn in his grand game of chess. You are a human shield. Dominic stood up, buttoning his pristine jacket. You are meant to draw the bullets away from the true king. When the war finally erupts and the shooting begins, my dear cousin will gladly let you take the fall. He is using your tragic desperation to protect his own empire. Dominic turned and walked back to his silver luxury vehicle, his bodyguards following silently behind him. The car glided away smoothly, leaving Clara completely paralyzed on the lonely park bench. The glossy, blood-stained photos scattered across her lap felt like burning coals scorching her skin. The warm, beautiful illusion of her protective, gentle husband violently fractured into a million sharp, irreparable pieces. She remembered the terrifying ease with which he had choked the street thug in the alley. She remembered the deep, violent bullet scars scattered across his broad back. They were not tragic wounds from a distant, closed chapter of his past. They were the active marks of a reigning, bloodthirsty monster. The deadly venom of doubt coursed fiercely through her veins, thoroughly poisoning the sweet, sacred memory of their very first kiss. The heavy steel door to the small apartment above the garage clicked shut behind Clara. The familiar, comforting aroma of roasted garlic and simmering tomato sauce filled the tiny living space. Vincent stood by the stove, wearing his canvas apron, stirring a pot with the gentle precision of a devoted husband. The stark, terrifying contrast between the domestic scene before her and the blood-soaked photographs burning a hole in her handbag made Clara feel physically ill. She walked directly to the kitchen counter and threw the thick brown envelope onto the wooden surface. The glossy pictures spilled out, displaying the brutal carnage and the undeniable proof of his true identity. Vincent froze completely. His dark eyes darted to the horrifying images of his own violent massacres, then moved slowly to meet her terrified, tear-filled gaze. The wooden spoon in his hand snapped in two with a loud, sharp crack. Clara backed away from him, her entire body shaking with a toxic mixture of profound betrayal and raw fear. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her broken heart. "You are not a disgraced outcast. You are the Dawn. You are the monster they all fear." and you bought me to act as your pathetic human shield while you wage a ruthless war against your own family." Vincent slowly untied his apron and let it fall carelessly to the floor. The gentle, quiet mechanic completely vanished into thin air. In his place stood the terrifying apex predator she had seen in the photographs. He stepped toward her, his strong jaw tightly clenched, his dark eyes swirling with a violent, desperate storm. "Clara, listen to me," he commanded, his gravelly voice dropping to a lethal octave. "Dominic is manipulating you. I never intended to use you as a shield. I married you to keep you completely out of their reach. I hid my true power to protect you from the very dark world I rule." Clara shook her head wildly, hot tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "How can I possibly believe a single word you say?" she cried out, her voice echoing off the thin walls. Every gentle touch, every meal, every kiss was built on a deeply rotten foundation of blood and lies. Before Vincent could utter another word to defend his dark actions, the heavy steel door of the apartment exploded inward with a deafening crash. Splinters of wood and jagged chunks of metal rained violently across the small living room. 5 heavily armed men dressed in dark tactical gear swarmed into the narrow space, raising suppressed automatic weapons directly toward them. Dominic had not just sent photos to poison her mind, he had sent a professional hit squad to finish the job while Vincent was emotionally distracted. Time seemed to slow down to a terrifying crawl. Clara screamed, covering her head as the very first barrage of bullets tore through the plaster walls, completely shattering the small television and shredding the fabric sofa into thousands of tiny pieces. Vincent did not dive for cover. He roared, a guttural, terrifying sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. In a fraction of a second, he lunged across the room, tackling Clara to the hard wooden floor and shielding her fragile body beneath his massive frame. The moment she was safely tucked behind the heavy oak kitchen island, the true monster was violently unleashed. Vincent drew a heavy black firearm from a concealed holster at the small of his back. He moved with a brutal, terrifying fluidity that completely defied human limits. He surged upward, firing 3 precise, deafening shots. The first 3 assassins dropped to the floor instantly, their tactical masks completely shattered by lethal strikes to the head. The remaining 2 gunmen panicked, spraying bullets wildly around the destroyed room. Vincent discarded his empty weapon and charged directly into the deadly line of fire without a single ounce of hesitation. He moved like a dark shadow forged from pure violence. He tackled the 4th man into the drywall, driving a vicious, sickening punch straight through the thick tactical vest, crushing the ribs of his attacker with a loud, sickening crunch. The final assassin tried to draw a sharp combat knife, but Vincent grabbed the wrist of the man, snapping the bone with a single, brutal twist. He snatched the falling blade right out of the air and drove it mercilessly into the chest of the final attacker, ending the brutal home invasion in less than 30 seconds. The small apartment was completely destroyed. The air was incredibly thick with the suffocating smell of gunpowder, shattered glass, and fresh blood. 5 bodies lay completely motionless on the ruined floorboards. Clara remained curled tightly against the wooden cabinets, her hands clamped fiercely over her ears, her beautiful eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She had just witnessed the absolute peak of human violence. The man she had kissed so passionately the night before was a literal killing machine. Vincent stood perfectly still among the bloody carnage, his broad chest heaving heavily. His pristine white shirt was soaked in the dark crimson blood of his enemies. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The cold, murderous fury in his dark eyes instantly melted away the second he saw her trembling form. He dropped the bloody knife and fell to his knees directly in front of her. He did not try to hide the dark monster he truly was anymore. He reached out with shaking, blood-stained hands and pulled Clara forcefully into his broad chest, wrapping his massive arms around her in an ironclad embrace. "I have got you," he whispered fiercely into her hair, his deep voice trembling with a raw, terrifying level of possessive desperation. "I will slaughter every single soul in this entire city before I let them touch a single hair on your head." Clara sobbed uncontrollably into his chest. She was absolutely terrified of the immense darkness he carried, But as she felt the frantic, desperate beating of his heart against hers, a profound realization washed over her shattered mind. Dominic was completely wrong. Vincent did not marry her to use her as a disposable pawn. He married her because his love was a violent, extreme obsession, and he was absolutely willing to burn the entire world down to ashes just to keep her safe. The metallic scent of fresh blood hung heavy in the destroyed apartment. Vincent slowly released his ironclad grip on Clara. His large hands, stained completely red, carefully brushed a stray strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. For a fleeting second, his dark eyes held a universe of unspoken devotion. But as the distant wail of police sirens pierced the night air, a profound and terrifying transformation overtook him. Vincent knew with absolute certainty that Dominic would not stop. The next attack would bring dozens of heavily armed men. Standing beside the Don of the Morreti family was an absolute death sentence. Vincent stood up, towering over her trembling form. He forced the raw, desperate love deep into the darkest corners of his soul and locked it away. When he looked down at her again, the gentle husband was completely gone. His expression hardened into a mask of pure, unfeeling granite. "Get up," he commanded. His grovelly voice was completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. Clara looked up at him in utter confusion. The sudden, freezing shift in his demeanor sent a violent shiver down her spine. "Vincent," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. He stepped back, deliberately avoiding her touch. The heavy steel door frame echoed with the sound of heavy boots. Half a dozen massive men in tailored suits poured into the ruined room. They were his loyal soldiers, arriving too late for the ambush, but exactly on time for the cleanup. Vincent ignored them and reached into the inside pocket of his ruined jacket. He pulled out a folded stack of crisp white papers and threw them carelessly onto the wooden floor near her knees. Clara stared at the documents. The bold black letters of the very top were unmistakable. They were official divorce papers, already signed with his sharp, aggressive signature. "Dominic told you the exact truth today," Vincent lied, his voice echoing with calculated cruelty. "You are nothing but a convenient shield. I needed a pathetic, highly visible distraction while I gathered my forces in the shadows. A penniless, desperate girl was the perfect camouflage. But the illusion is completely useless now. The war has officially begun, and I no longer have any use for dead weight." The cruel words struck Clara harder than any physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the man who had just risked his own life to shield her from a storm of bullets. None of this made any sense. He had cooked for her, kissed her with consuming passion, and shielded her body with his own. Yet the cold, dead eyes staring back at her now belonged to a complete stranger. "Sign the papers," Vincent ordered coldly. "The contract is officially terminated." Clara felt her entire world shatter for the second time. Hot, bitter tears spilled over her cheeks. She grabbed a pen from the broken debris on the floor and aggressively signed her name, her hand shaking with pure agony. She threw the papers at his heavy boots. Vincent did not even flinch. He turned his broad back toward her, addressing his towering lieutenant. "Take her to the secure compound in the northern woods. Lock her inside. If she tries to leave, restrain her. I do not want to see her face ever again." Before Clara could scream or protest, two massive guards grabbed her arms. They dragged her out of the blood-soaked apartment, pulling her away from the only man who had ever made her feel safe. She sobbed violently, calling his name, but Vincent never turned around. He stood perfectly still among the dead bodies, a solitary king preparing to burn his own kingdom to the ground. The drive into the dark, desolate countryside took 3 agonizing hours. Clara sat in the back of the armored sport utility vehicle, completely dead inside. She had lost absolutely everything. When they finally arrived at a massive, heavily fortified stone cabin hidden deep within the dense forest, the guards escorted her into a lavishly furnished bedroom and locked the heavy oak door behind her. Clara collapsed onto the large bed, burying her face in the pillows. She cried until she had absolutely no tears left. Hours passed in suffocating silence. Eventually, her exhausted eyes caught sight of a thick leather folder resting on the bedside table. It had her name elegantly embossed on the cover. With trembling fingers, she opened the folder. Inside was not another cruel threat. It was a stack of certified banking documents and legal property deeds. Clara blinked, her mind struggling to process the overwhelming information. Her personal bank account had just received a direct transfer of $50 million. Furthermore, the documents granted her full, uncontested legal ownership of every single legitimate enterprise Vincent had ever built. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as the absolute truth finally hit her. The brutal cruelty in the apartment had been a deeply calculated theatrical act. By legally divorcing her and throwing her away, Vincent had completely severed their public ties, making her absolutely useless to Dominic as a hostage. He had intentionally shattered her heart to force her into hiding, ensuring she would survive the upcoming bloodbath. He had given her his entire fortune and his legal empire, walking into a deadly mafia war with absolutely nothing left to lose. He had pushed her away because his love was so profound. He was willing to die alone in the dark just so she could live in the light. The profound revelation of the leather folder still echoed in Clara's mind when the heavy oak door of her bedroom suddenly clicked open. She expected to see one of the towering guards bringing her a meal. Instead, a chilling, familiar voice echoed through the hallway. Dominic stepped into the luxurious room, his expensive charcoal suit looking completely out of place in the rustic forest cabin. Behind him, the very same security Captain Vincent had trusted stood with his head bowed, grasping a thick stack of cash. The fortress had not been breached by force. It had been effortlessly unlocked by treason. Clara jumped to her feet, dropping the legal documents. Her defiance was instantaneous, but it completely shattered a second later when two more thugs entered the room. They were pushing a hospital wheelchair. Sitting in it was her mother, looking incredibly frail and heavily sedated, an intravenous drip still attached to her fragile arm. "You truly believed my pathetic cousin could hide you from me?" Dominic sneered, walking forward to stroke her cheek. Clara violently jerked her head away. "Money buys absolute loyalty, my dear. Vincent is a beast, but he fundamentally misunderstands human greed." Clara felt a suffocating wave of panic, but she aggressively forced it down. She could not afford to break down and cry, not when her mother was in immediate mortal danger. As the thugs forcefully grabbed her arms to drag her out, Clara intentionally stumbled against the corrupted security captain. In the brief, chaotic collision, her swift fingers slipped into the tactical pouch on his combat vest. She extracted a tiny metallic emergency positioning beacon, concealing it flawlessly in the tight palm of her hand. They were thrown into the back of an unmarked transport van. The journey lasted for roughly 2 hours. Clara held her unconscious mother tightly in her arms, wrapping her own coat around the frail woman to protect her from the freezing air. Throughout the terrifying ride, Clara kept her small hand tightly closed, protecting the stolen beacon like a sacred artifact. The van eventually arrived at a massive abandoned industrial slaughterhouse situated on the desolate outskirts of the city. The air inside the cavernous building was thick with the putrid stench of old rust and decaying concrete. Heavy iron meat hooks swung ominously from the high ceiling, clinking together like grim funeral bells. Dominic sat gracefully on a wooden crate in the center of the vast room, surrounded by dozens of heavily armed mercenaries. He ordered his men to tie Clara to a rusted metal pillar. Her mother was positioned nearby, still completely unconscious in her wheelchair. Dominic pulled out a sleek mobile phone and dialed a highly encrypted number. He pressed the speaker button and held the device up for Clara to hear. The line connected with a sharp click. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain how you want to die, Dominic," the gravelly, lethal voice of Vincent radiated through the small speaker. The sheer volume of pure, murderous rage in his tone made the surrounding mercenaries shift uncomfortably. Dominic laughed, a cold, grating sound. "Always so dramatic, cousin. But I think you are the one who needs to choose how you die today. I am currently looking at your beautiful discarded wife and her precious mother. It turns out your loyal guards prefer my money over your fear." A suffocating, dead silence fell over the phone line. The absolute quiet was infinitely more terrifying than any verbal threat. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominic continued, his tone dripping with toxic arrogance. "You will surrender the entire territorial map and sign over every single syndicate right to my name. Then you will drive to the abandoned shipping yards on the East River. You will come completely alone. You will step out of your vehicle, put your own gun to your head, and you will pull the trigger. If I do not get confirmation of your suicide in exactly 1 hour, I will personally carve your beautiful wife into tiny pieces while she watches her mother bleed out on this filthy floor." Clara felt a massive surge of adrenaline. She knew Vincent would actually do it. He would gladly blow his own brains out to save her. She could not let that happen. "Do not listen to him, Vincent." Clara screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing fiercely off the concrete walls. "He is a pathetic coward. He needs you to kill yourself because he is absolutely terrified to face you in a real fight." Dominic snarled in sudden, uncontrollable fury. He stepped forward and struck Clara across the face with the back of his hand. The vicious blow snapped her head to the side, splitting her delicate lip. Warm blood trickled down her chin, but she refused to shed a single tear. She glared up at him with burning, unyielding defiance. "Shut her up," Dominic barked at his guards, completely losing his refined composure. The sudden physical assault and the chaotic shouting provided the exact distraction Clara desperately needed. While all the armed men were focused on the violent interaction, Clara slowly dragged her tied hands down the rusted pillar. She subtly pressed the activation button on the small metallic beacon she had stolen earlier. A tiny invisible pulse of location data instantly shot out into the digital ether. She carefully dropped the activated device into a deep, dark crack in the concrete floor beneath her boots, rendering it completely invisible to the naked eye. Dominic snatched the phone back, his chest heaving with anger. 1 hour, Vincent. The clock is ticking. He violently ended the call. Clara leaned her head back against the cold iron pillar, tasting her own blood. She did not tremble. She did not beg for mercy. She simply closed her eyes and waited, knowing with absolute certainty that the terrifying monster she loved was already hunting them down, guided by the silent, invisible beacon pulsing in the dark. Less than 20 minutes had passed since the phone call ended. Dominic paced arrogantly across the filthy concrete floor, glancing at his expensive gold watch. He was completely oblivious to the silent, invisible beacon pulsing steadily from the dark crack beneath Clara. Suddenly, the heavy industrial lights illuminating the cavernous slaughterhouse flickered and died, plunging the entire massive building into pitch-black darkness. Panic instantly erupted among the mercenaries. Shots echoed through the dark, accompanied by the frantic clicking of safety mechanisms being disengaged from automatic weapons. Before anyone could grab a flashlight, the rusted iron skylights above shattered simultaneously in a deafening cascade of broken glass. Thick canisters of tear gas rained down, hissing violently as they blanketed the floor in a blinding white fog. Then, the absolute slaughter began. There was no warning and absolutely no mercy. Muffled gunshots from suppressed weapons echoed with terrifying precision. Dominic and his men were not facing a rival street gang. They were facing the absolute apex of the Chicago underworld, led by a man consumed by apocalyptic rage. Mercenaries dropped to the ground one by one, eliminated by invisible shadows moving flawlessly through the thick smoke. Clara strained against her ropes, coughing slightly from the edge of the gas cloud. Through the swirling white mist, a massive, terrifying silhouette emerged. Vincent did not wear a tailored suit or a canvas apron. He was clad in dark tactical armor, his face smeared with black grease and fresh blood. He looked like the physical embodiment of absolute vengeance. Dominic screamed in pure terror, blindly firing his handgun into the fog. Two of his remaining elite guards realized the perimeter was completely lost. In a desperate, cowardly bid for leverage, one of the heavily armed thugs raised his assault rifle, aiming directly at the unconscious woman in the wheelchair. Clara screamed the name of her mother, pulling violently at her bindings. Vincent moved faster than humanly possible. He launched his massive frame across the open space, throwing himself directly in front of the fragile wheelchair just as the mercenary pulled the trigger. A loud crack pierced the air. Vincent grunted as the high-caliber bullet grazed deeply across his upper shoulder, tearing through the tactical armor and his flesh. He did not even break his stride. Utilizing the raw momentum of his dive, Vincent raised his own weapon and fired a single flawless shot right through the skull of the mercenary, instantly neutralizing the lethal threat. Clara watched in absolute awe. The bloodthirsty mafia boss had just taken a bullet to protect her fragile, innocent mother. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of a devotion that transcended logic and self-preservation. The remaining mercenaries threw down their weapons and surrendered, dropping to their knees in absolute terror. The chaotic firefight ceased, leaving only the heavy silence of death and the terrifying sound of heavy boots walking slowly toward the center of the room. Dominic backed away, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He tripped over a wooden crate and fell hard onto the blood-soaked concrete. He scrambled backward like a pathetic coward, begging frantically for his miserable life, promising to return all the stolen money and leave the country forever. Vincent ignored the pathetic pleas. He stopped right in front of his treacherous cousin, his dark eyes locking onto the fresh bruise and the dried blood on the delicate lip of Clara. The sight of her injury pushed the Don past the absolute point of no return. "You touched my wife," Vincent whispered, his gravelly voice echoing with demonic finality. Vincent reached down and grabbed Dominic by the collar of his expensive charcoal shirt, lifting the screaming man effortlessly into the air. With brutal, terrifying precision, Vincent completely dismantled his enemy. There was no grand speech. There was only the absolute execution of the ultimate penalty. Vincent ended the miserable life of his cousin with his bare hands, fulfilling the lethal promise he had made to anyone who dared to harm his queen. Dropping the lifeless body to the floor, Vincent turned his back on the carnage. He walked over to the rusted pillar and pulled a sharp combat knife to slice through the thick ropes binding Clara. The moment her hands were completely free, Clara threw herself into his arms, completely ignoring the terrifying violence surrounding them and the fresh blood soaking his sleeve. She buried her face in his broad chest, holding on to him as if he were the only solid anchor in a violently spinning universe. Vincent dropped his weapon and wrapped his massive, uninjured arm tightly around her, burying his face in her sweet hair, breathing in her familiar scent as the absolute king of the underworld reclaimed his stolen heart. The chaotic dust finally settled over the city, leaving Vincent as the absolute, uncontested king of the Chicago underworld. With his throne totally secure, he systematically eradicated the lingering toxic shadows of the past without ever needing to shed another drop of blood. Instead of physical violence, Vincent utilized his immense economic empire to completely crush Evelyn and Chloe. Within a matter of weeks, the wicked stepmother and stepsister were thoroughly investigated, entirely bankrupted, and thrown into a cold federal prison cell for decades of extensive financial fraud. All their stolen luxury was stripped away, delivering a poetic and absolute justice. Meanwhile, under the flawless care of the absolute best medical professionals in the world, the mother of Clara recovered beautifully, growing stronger with each passing day in a premier private rehabilitation center. Several months later, Clara walked into the breathtaking, sunlit kitchen of their sprawling new estate. Despite the massive mansion, the endless wealth, and the invisible army of loyal guards patrolling the perimeter, the profound core of their relationship remained beautifully unchanged. Vincent stood by the expansive marble counter. His towering, scarred frame was clad in his familiar canvas apron as he meticulously prepared a rich, steaming Italian breakfast just for her. Hearing her footsteps, Vincent turned around. He wiped his large, calloused hands on a towel and reached into the pocket of his shirt. He pulled out the crisp white divorce documents from that terrifying night of the ambush. Without breaking his intense eye contact with Clara, he slowly tore the painful papers into tiny, unrecognizable pieces, letting them fall uselessly to the floor. Vincent then closed the distance between them and dropped gracefully to one knee. The terrifying boss of the syndicate looked up at her, his dark eyes radiating nothing but absolute, eternal devotion. He produced a magnificent, flawless vintage diamond ring, the true, sacred heirloom of the Morreti family. This time, there was no cruel ultimatum and absolutely no desperate contract. He offered his heart, his empire, and his eternal protection, asking her to be his queen by choice. Clara smiled brightly, tears of pure joy streaming down her cheeks, and whispered a resounding yes, sealing their unbreakable vow of blood and silk forever. Every story leaves a profound echo in our souls. This journey teaches us that true love possesses the incredible power to look beyond terrifying rumors and deep physical scars to find the gentle, protective heart hiding within. It reminds us that no matter how much the wicked scheme and manipulate, absolute justice will inevitably catch up to them. Furthermore, it highlights a profound humanistic value that true strength is never measured by the ability to cause harm, but by the ultimate willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the fragile people we hold dear. How did this passionate tale make you feel? Can you relate these intense struggles, the painful misunderstandings, and the ultimate pursuit of genuine love to your own reality? Please share your deepest thoughts and emotions in the comments section below, as we truly desire to listen to the feelings coming from deep within your heart. If you enjoyed this dramatic journey of love and redemption, please click the subscribe button, like, and share our channel to experience many more captivating videos every single day. We sincerely wish every single one of you watching this video absolute good health, a joyful life every day, and profound peace. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.